And welcome to Urban Green Live. I'm your host, John Mandyck, the CEO of Urban Green. This is a program series where I'll be interviewing global experts to better understand how we get to a zero carbon future. And you get to participate too, because we'll have live Q&A in just a bit on our platform called Slido. You'll see a chat with the information to access Slido so you can load your Q&A for the back half of our program. Now, today we're going to dive into Local Law 97 from a perspective that's not often discussed, and that's the role of city-owned buildings. And so my guest today is the person responsible for implementing Local Law 97 for city buildings. He's Anthony Fiore, Deputy Commissioner and Chief Decarbonization Officer for the New York City Department of Citywide Administrative Services, or DCAS, as you may know it. Anthony, welcome to Urban Green Live.
Thank you, John. Pleasure to be here.
Great. Anthony, I want to start with, you must have the coolest title in the world, Chief Decarbonization Officer. Tell me about that title.
Well, thank you for that. Sure. I mean, it was intentional. The title really is to signal what we're trying to achieve here. My previous title was Chief Energy Management Officer. And a lot of times folks looked at that as energy savings, right? And reducing energy is one tool in the toolbox to get to decarbonization. But we wanted to really send a strong message that what we're trying to do is decarbonize our built environment, and hence the change in title.
Great. Chief Decarbonization Officer. We will know that we have all done our job when everybody has that title. So let's start with your agency. Tell us about the role and reach of DCAS.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So DCAS serves as the hub or the back office for city government. And it provides a number of important shared service to all of the government agencies, including human capital, hiring and training our city employees, fleet management, procurement for city agencies, and real estate services, buying and selling buildings, leasing buildings, and so forth. And I think most germane to this discussion here today is we also serve as the hub for energy management across the city's portfolio. So I'm responsible for energy management at DCAS, and we work to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions or the city's carbon footprint from our buildings, from our non-building stationary assets like wastewater, resource recovery facilities, and streetlights and traffic lights and so forth, as well as from our fleet.
That's quite a large portfolio. How many buildings are we talking about?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked. I mean, we have over 4,000 buildings in our portfolio, and it's a diverse portfolio. It's everything from offices and courthouses to recreation and community centers, police precincts and firehouses and sanitation garages, museums, zoos, public libraries, and other cultural institutions, hospitals, schools, universities, and many more. So quite a large portfolio and quite diverse.
Yeah, and that's quite the laboratory for decarbonization, given the variety of uses and types of buildings.
It is.
Great. So what does Local Law 97 require of city buildings? Let's kind of just start with the basics.
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because I've heard a lot of misconception out there that Local Law 97 doesn't actually apply to the city government. And in fact, it does. As most of your audience knows, in 2019, City Council passed the Climate Mobilization Act. It was a suite of legislation really aimed to get at deep decarbonization. And the centerpiece of that, of course, was Local Law 97. And what that requires of the city is for city government operations to reduce its emissions 40% by 2025 and 50% by 2030. And that goes beyond what the law requires for the private sector.
So that's a lot, 50% by 2050.
50% by 2030.
By 2030,
Yeah.
by 2030, correct. When the law for the private sector is a 40% reduction by that.
Correct.
By that time
Correct.
frame. That's right. That's right. So what's your role with Local Law 97 as the Chief Decarbonization Officer for DCAS?
Really, there's two dimensions to this role. The first is in planning, and the second is in supporting our agency partners. So with the first dimension, we wanted to establish a plan, really a roadmap for how does the city get to these deep decarbonization mandates. And there we established our implementation action plan. It really is that roadmap. It shows a pathway of how we get there. And for the first time ever, it established agency-specific targets and pathways. So that had never been done before. We managed the portfolio as an entire portfolio. But in terms of setting expectations for each agency and the agency's heads, we felt it very important to have agency-specific targets. And those targets, as you can see on the slide that's here, was really tailored to each agency's specific portfolio. They're not all the same, as I just went over. It's quite a diversity. It was also based on each agency's capacity to implement work, as well as the complexity of the type of work to be done in their building portfolio, relative to the complexity of the work that they have done in the past. And finally, the cost, the relative cost to do a specific intervention in one type of building, in one type of agency versus another. And as you can imagine, in some instances, it's maybe more cost effective to do a particular intervention in an office building than it is in a cultural institution where there's more environmental control measures.
Can you give us a couple examples on how those ranges, like what are those ranges from kind of high to low maybe, and how are they determined by each agency?
In terms of cost or?
The actual carbon reduction.
Sure. So what we did is we looked at the city portfolio. We looked at all the different building types in that portfolio, and we went through an exercise to categorize those into typologies. And we came out with about 23 unique typologies. We did energy modeling on those typologies. And from that, we came up with emission reduction opportunities that we bundled together that could be applied to the different typologies. And so really, these agency-specific targets are a result of the emission reduction opportunities available to each agency based on the building typologies that make up its portfolio.
Got it. So 4,000 buildings covered by Local Law 97 for city-owned buildings. Give us a sense for how that's, do you know how that scales for other cities? Like, you know, New York City's has to be the largest city footprint, but if you look at like other cities like Chicago, Boston, how do we rank for number of city-owned buildings in this city?
I don't have the exact numbers, but my sense in speaking with other sustainability directors across the country is that the city's portfolio is by far larger than most other cities, especially in the United States. Now, of course, there's some global cities that are metropolises, but they don't have the same programs in place on a city government level to actually get at deep decarbonization.
Right. I mean, it strikes me that the city's portfolio is a mini city in itself as measured by many other measures.
I mean, in most instances, when you talk about New York City, and this goes for the number of buildings, but it also goes to the amount of services the city provides, we're really at a state level, right? In many instances, what the city, the scope and scale of the city is the same as many states across the country.
So let's dive into, you know, the actual plan. So what are some of the plans in place to achieve this 50% reduction by 2040? Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, I mean, I really like to start with what we've done so far, right? Where are we? And you know, to date, or since 2014 to date, we've invested about $800 million in our buildings. And our non-stationary or stationary non-buildings. We've implemented over 10,300 different energy conservation measures across more than 2,000 unique buildings. So across at least half of the portfolio, but those 2,000 square feet represent about, those 2,000 unique buildings represent about 70% of the square footage. So really have gotten at a lot of it already. And we've avoided about 2.9 million MMBTUs in energy use through those energy conservation measures. And that's equivalent to about 200,000 New York City residences. So
Wow.
that kind of gives you the sense of scale. We've also deployed more than 100 rooftop solar projects for a total installed capacity of 16 megawatts and about 19 million kilowatt hours per year of clean energy generation. And that would power about 4,500 New York City residences. So quite a lot there as well. But we've also upskilled over 1,700 unique city employees through a training program, an energy management institute that we have in partnership with the City University of New York. That's covered over 3,800 unique city employees with over 5,800 total participants. And we have 1,100 city employees with professional certifications through that training program. In addition, we're reaching into the schools, right? We want to make sure that the younger generation is prepared for this type of environment going forward and the workforce that is coming from it. So we've trained over 1,000 teachers and reached over 3,500 students through the city's public school system. This has all resulted in about a 27% reduction in emissions from government operations and an 11% reduction in peak energy demand. And as you know, that has important consequences for system reliability. So really done a lot there. And I'm proud to say that 65% of the emission reductions that we've gotten to date and 70% of the PM 2.5 reductions that we've gotten to date have all occurred in disadvantaged communities. And that's a really important metric for this administration. We look at everything through an equity lens. We saw how the pandemic affected disadvantaged populations, and climate change is no different. So what do we have to do going forward? We've got to build on that work. And so we need to do two basic things. We need to do work in buildings, and we need to put in place changes to policy and operational initiatives that will support that work in buildings. So let me start with the work that we need to do in buildings. And there's really four key interventions that we're talking about here. The first is planned energy efficiency. We've already got a number of projects that are planned and ready to go. And these projects are, they'll be recognizable to your audience, right? Their lighting, their control technologies, their steam traps, their HVAC and chiller replacements, boiler replacements, boiler tune-ups, and so forth. The second is solar PV deployment. We've got 16 megawatts. We've got a goal to get to 100 megawatts by 2025. And really that's important from a public visibility perspective, right? It really shows that the city is prioritizing climate change mitigation. It's the tip of the sword in this fight against climate change. The third is a heat electrification program. The city's done a number of studies, and there's been studies done across the country and globally that all indicate that much of our built environment will have to be electrified. So taking our heating and hot water systems and electrifying those. So that's really going to be necessary to get to those longer term deep decarbonization goals of an 80% reduction by 2050 and carbon neutrality. The benefit, we're starting that now, and there's a few reasons why. There's a benefit to the electrification ecosystem. This is an emerging technology that's not really matured across all different building typologies. So we're looking to use the city's assets as an incubator to build lessons learned and share that knowledge with the private sector. The second is that reduces criteria pollutants that have harmful public health impacts, right? Again, getting back to disadvantaged communities, we really want to prioritize electrification in those communities reduce those criteria pollutants, and improve public health. And then the last one is you think about the probable useful life of these assets. And what we want to do is minimize stranded assets and sunk costs. So if we don't replace these systems as they begin to age out now, they may not be available for us in 20 years or 25 years as we approach 2050 to then again change out. And then the last piece of that is additional energy efficiency projects. Again, this is some of the same types of projects that I mentioned before, the operational improvements, the lighting upgrades, continuous commissioning, and HVAC upgrades and replacements. The second piece to this is putting changes in policy and operations to support all of this work, right? And those are in 4 general areas as well. The first is around accountability initiatives. That's really meant to help all stakeholders, from people that operate buildings to the agency heads to the public, understand how we're advancing towards both the near-term goals and our long-term goals. And an example of that is we will begin to be reporting out on agency-specific targets and the progress towards those. And that's not meant to be a gotcha moment for any agency, but it's to understand how we're progressing through each agency and rebalance our expectations as we move forward. The second is around people initiatives, right? You need the people in place to implement at scale. That's people in DCAS doing more of this type of work. It's more people out in the agencies. We find that the closer you are to the problem, the more innovative you can be in finding a solution. So that's really important. And also the right staff with the right skills at many of our authorizing entities. So folks in our Office of Management and Budget, or with our law department, or the Mayor's Office of Contracts. These are really points that can streamline the city's procurement and contracting process and project delivery and get that to scale. The third is coordination and collaboration. And that really, we want to ensure that we plan and implement at speed and scale and remain focused. And an example of that is really having a holistic, comprehensive contracting strategy. And I'll give you one example of that that's happening now in real time. Currently, DCAS does not have design build authorization. We find that that's going to be really important to speeding up project delivery. Right now, we go out and we procure a design engineer, we design for a year or more, how long ever that takes. Then we have to go out and bid and get a construction contractor and then contract. That takes 18 months of just upfront work and then 3 years of the design and construction. So that's not going to work anymore. So we want to do some of this work through design build, and we're working with the state legislature right now to try to get DCAS added to the city authorization for that work. And the last one is optimized building operations. And this is really about using data to transform energy management work in buildings. An example of that is we're installing real-time meters across the portfolio. We've installed enough meters that cover about 70% of our energy consumption to date on the electric side, and we're beginning to install real-time meters on the gas and steam side. And that really empowers our building operators to make changes and see the impact of those changes in real time. So hopefully that gives you some flavor.
Yeah, that's amazing. But like, this is one of the biggest stories maybe not heard. I mean, $800 million, 2,000 buildings, 70% of the square footage area of the city, 27% reduction. That's a heck of an incubator you got going there. So it like builds on my next question. Are you seeing common strategies for decarbonization that weave throughout the diversity of these buildings?
Yeah, and it's a great question, right? So with 4,000 buildings, you've got to find some commonalities, right, in order to do this work at scale. And the implementation action plan that we just published really is the avatar for that standardization, right? It looked at the full portfolio, and then it identified commonalities across these different building typologies that I discussed before. You know, it looked at things like the square footage of buildings, the vintage of the buildings, the operational characteristics of the buildings, among other things. And as I mentioned, we took that, we grouped those into 23 unique typologies. We then we did the energy modeling on those typologies, found the emission reduction opportunities that could be applied to that, and bundled those together, and are now going out and doing that work. So, you know, that being said, still each building presents itself with its specific circumstances that also have to be addressed. But, you know, across these buildings, there are many of the things I've already mentioned. Lighting. We've done a lot on lighting already, high efficiency lighting, LED lighting, but there's more to do there, and we can get at more. Mechanical systems and boiler systems, a lot of improvements that we can do on that front as well, including more variable frequency drives and demand controlled ventilation. So those are some of the types of interventions that we're expecting to see across all of the typologies and to implement at scale.
Great. Thank you, Anthony. So I'll remind the audience, in a few minutes, we'll open it up for audience questions. Go to slido.com, use the code LL97 to load your questions, and we'll get to those in a little bit. So you're more than half the way there, 27% reduction. You got to get to 50. Do you have like this big thermometer in your office that kind of tracks that?
Yeah, I think the thermometer is internally built because of the angst of doing this. And it's really, you know, the 2025 mandates. That's a real near-term thing. It's around the corner. I mean, it's 3 years away. When you think about, you know, these types of capital projects that we're talking about, they take time to do. And so, you know, 2025 is that first milestone. I think, you know, through the pandemic, we've been set back. You know, we've lost about 2 years worth of work. But, you know, we're pushing forward really hard. And then as we get to 2030, you know, I think my internal temperature goes down a little bit. And then as we get to 2050, hopefully even more. And we see that we're really on pace to achieve those deep decarbonization. So,
you know, what are the biggest challenges? What revs up your internal thermometer as you think about, let's start with 2025.
Well, you know, it's been said that, you know, success is not measured by what you accomplish, right? But by the opposition that you face and the courage that you maintain against the struggle of overwhelming odds. So if that is the measurement of success, I think we are going to be very successful. I mean, you know, this question could be a whole show of itself, but just a couple of things that are top of mind. And I've kind of alluded to that already. The first is really 2025 is right around the corner, right? So 40% reduction in emissions is a challenge of itself, let alone having to do that in the next three years, which again, as I mentioned, has been heightened by the pandemic and you know, 2 years of lost opportunity. So it's going to require a lot to go right across our buildings and our non-building stationary assets and our fleet, and also our electric supply and the greening of our grid. The second is delays related to the global supply chain crunch, right? I think we're all experiencing that. It's hit us already. We're experiencing on every project weeks to months delays at the minimum. And you know, that one's kind of tough because it's not really fully in our control. The third is some of the geopolitical events that are happening around the world right now, beginning with tariffs on solar components, right? That's starting to impact our work. LNG exports to meet demand in Asia and Europe, and that, you know, and then the invasion of Ukraine, and you know, our hearts and thoughts go out to all the Ukrainians there as well as here in New York City. We really are praying for all of you. And then labor shortages as well. And so these things are really affecting us. And I think, we really need to accelerate our procurement and project delivery vehicles. And that's part of that collaboration that I talked about before and streamlining this type of work. It's not all doom and gloom, though. So, I don't want anybody to get that feeling, because on the other side of every challenge is opportunity, right? And, we're lucky because there's a new administration in place, new climate leadership. And I have to really give my hats off to Rit Agarwal, the city's chief climate officer. Many of your audience will be familiar with Rit. Rit served under Bloomberg. He was really the architect of Plan NYC. And it shows the leadership of this administration to bring somebody like Rit back into the fold. And they're really now laser focused on implementation, right? And so that's really going to be great. And we're working across government to really think outside the box about ways to unlock quick, focused government action to get at this deep decarbonization in the near term. So challenges are large, but I've never had or worked with a more dedicated workforce than what I've seen in city government. It's heartwarming to see the dedication to mission that these folks have in DCAS, across our agency partners, and at other entities, including the Office of Management and Budget and Mayor's Office of Contracts and others. There really is a laser focus around this now.
So building on that theme of opportunity, do you think, the city as this big incubator with 4,000 buildings, do you think you're learning things that can apply to non-city owned buildings?
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. The portfolio is a little bit different, right? Our portfolio is more akin to the commercial portfolio, not so much from the multifamily. Mm-hmm. Although, we work very closely with NYCHA, and there's a lot of lessons to be learned. And we partnership on a number of things, including an innovation program and others. But I think one of the lessons learned is that you have to have buy-in, right? And it's buy-in at all levels. It's buy-in from the folks that are operating the buildings, and it's buy-in from leadership. It's got to be a top-down and bottom-up approach that meets in the middle. One without the other will not lead to success. Our program started out with really spending a lot of time with the people that operate the buildings. And really, those are the folks that identified the problems and identified a lot of the solutions. To get that implemented, you have to have the buy-in of leadership. And we're seeing that now more so than ever before. I think the other thing that we've learned is you need to plan for the long term, right? These emission mandates are only getting more stringent over time. And you've really got to look ahead at what's coming and plan for that. And that'll put you in a much more better position to be successful. And just building on that is aligning these emission reduction opportunities with state of good repair projects and building owners' capital investment plan cycles, right? I think a good thing to do is to conduct an energy master plan for your buildings. And that really ties together state of good repair with emission reduction opportunities and how you weave that into your capital plan. So I think those are some of the things that are common across private and public facilities.
Great. So you mentioned electrification before. What is the DCAS approach for electrification?
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, it's one of the 4 building blocks of our implementation action plan. And we're beginning that now, starting in this coming fiscal year 23 for the city begins July 1st. We will start our first projects in electrification. And our plan is to steadily ramp up to about 2% of our total square footage per year by 2030. And if we do that, we think we can realize about 52,000 metric ton reduction in our carbon emissions, or about 18% of the amount that we need to get by 2030. And so, that's looking at the systems now that are beginning to age out and not replacing those in kind, right? Mm-hmm. And so we're going to prioritize those first, as I talked about before, these systems that are in disadvantaged communities, because there's good co-benefits from the public health outcome improvements that can be had by doing this type of work. So those systems that are aging out, that are in disadvantaged communities, and starting with those that are still running on number 4 or number 2 fuel oil, and really attacking those first. And where we can't do full electrification because of the complexity of the building and the maturity of the technology, or for whatever other reason, we'll look to do hybrid systems so that we can at least partially electrify those buildings. So that's really our plan going forward.
Great. I have one more question, then we're going to turn it over to the audience. I see a lot of questions coming in, so that's great. So Local Law 97 is a big part of your job, obviously. What other sustainability initiatives fall under what DCAS is doing with city buildings?
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked that, because the implementation action plan that we put together is not just about Local Law 97. That's certainly the big driver, but the city's thought process around how to manage energy and how to decarbonize has evolved over time. And so there are many laws on the books and other commitments that have been made over time that this plan actually weaved together so that we can have a comprehensive plan and get at all of that. And I've mentioned these before, but quickly, one of those that we didn't really talk about is getting to 100% renewable electric supply by 2025. Right. So we've talked a lot about the demand side interventions that we can do, but the other lever that we have is what type of energy do we buy? So I'm really proud to say that we recently signed a contract with the state of New York to buy enough renewable electric to cover 100% of our electric consumption in any given year for a 25-year period. And this is related to the state's clean energy standard and its Tier 4 program that is requiring renewable energy to be brought to the city. So that's one thing. The 100 megawatts of clean energy, distributed clean energy generation, or solar PV on our buildings is another. The other piece with all these demand side interventions is we have a target to reduce our energy consumption 20% by 2030. And that is a significant reduction in energy consumption. And it's important to be coupled with those supply side interventions so that we don't have to overbuild our electric supply system. And we talked about the heat electrification program. One other is our innovation program. And I think, this is really where can we get greater penetration of innovative technology, high efficiency equipment, newer clean energy generation technology by using the city's assets, right? And build use cases for the private sector. And we started to partner with the Economic Development Corporation and NYCHA to expand the breadth of the types of buildings, like you asked just a minute ago, to cover a much greater cross section. And that, is to use our city assets as an incubator for these types of interventions. And, lastly is, I think, greater partnerships, right? Greater partnerships with entities like Urban Green. There's a whole lot of people out there that care a lot about climate change and care a lot about our city. And we're humble enough to know that this is an all hands on deck moment for the city and for the world. And the more people that we've got oars in the water rowing in the same direction, the more chance of success that we have.
Great. Thank you, Anthony. So let's get to the audience questions that are coming in. They're rolling in a lot. You can upvote your questions on Slido. So I see here the number one voted question. It says, In 2019, the city tagged 9 buildings for deep energy retrofits to comply with Local Law 97. Have these been implemented, and are more facilities going to be added?
Yeah, so those projects are underway right now, and the purpose of that program is really to get at a 50% or more energy reduction or greenhouse gas emission reduction from those buildings. So it's a whole building approach, and yes, certainly we want to add more of that type of whole building system to the portfolio of interventions that we're doing.
Great. Next question here. We touched on this a little bit, but maybe you want to expand on it. What are the biggest lessons industry can learn from the city's decarbonizations efforts?
So, I think the whole city's approach is to lead by example, right? And so, and I think we've seen that in the past when, we look at the emission reductions that have been achieved in the public sector versus the private sector. And it's really showing that the investments that the city is making, the planning that we're doing, so that we can integrate our state of good repair into the capital replacement cycle is really important. And I think that, that's certainly transferable to the private sector.
You had mentioned earlier, Tier 4 is a question around that. Is the city's commitment to carbon-free energy dependent on the PSC approving both Tier 4 projects?
Yes. So the short answer is yes. So what the city wanted to do, we wanted to make sure that we were using our purchasing power to really catalyze the scope and scale that's really necessary to get to the deep decarbonization. So our contract with the state says that that's contingent on both projects being approved, because that also is the tip of the iceberg. These 2 projects alone don't get us there. That, in combination with significant build out of offshore wind and additional on-site deployment of solar and wind resources in upstate New York, and the transmission to get that into the city, are all going to be required.
Great. Next question about job creation here is interesting. Let me just rephrase a little bit. Like, what jobs are needed to accelerate decarbonization, or job training, or job categories, or skills?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, because it's a lot of different jobs that are necessary. It's the technical aspect of it, right? It's our design engineers, it's energy management professionals, the strategic planning, but it's also the trades, right? And we've been seeing over time a waning of the trades, and that's something that really needs to be brought back. I mean, these folks are really been doing green jobs forever, right? Every time you improve the operation of existing equipment, you get more out of that equipment in terms of energy efficiency. So that's really important. But one other thing that I found, and this is a commonality, I think, with the private sector from my discussions with some large real estate management professionals, is more and more things are becoming automated, right? And it's a different skill set than what we've seen out there in the past to interface with the human machine interface pieces and the programmable logic controllers. And so I think that's a real area that's ripe for some curriculum development, and maybe in some of our public higher education institutions, but really to bring that skill set forward.
Our audience loves to dive into details. Here's a great question. What's been the most challenging city building to work on?
The most challenging city building to work on. So, I think they each have their own challenges, right? And so an example of this is schools, right? In schools, you have to work around the children that are there. We're not going to interrupt education to do this work. So there's access requirements, there's off-hour work that has to be done. But let's take another example. Let's look at cultural institutions and museums and zoos and our aquariums and so forth. They each have unique challenges too, because you can't take systems down when you have cultural artifacts and animals that are are being protected. I think those are some of the different types of challenges that are out there, but each one offers its own unique.
Let's put you in the role of a magician here. On top of of all the great things you're doing already, like if you could have a magic wand, what technologies do you think we need now that could accelerate decarbonization?
So two come top of mind, right? First is the electrification and having that apply to more building typologies and in retrofit applications, right? I mean, we didn't talk about this, but your audience certainly knows that 90% of the buildings that are here today are going to be here in 2050. And so this work is really about retrofit in existing buildings. We need to change our codes and standards for new buildings, but the majority of the work is in existing buildings. So how do we advance the technology around electrification for retrofit applications across this diverse set of building typologies? The second is energy storage, right? As we become more and more reliable on variable production, renewable resources like wind and sun, we have to have technologies other than fossil fuel technologies that fill that gap. One of the projects under Tier 4, the Champlain Hudson Power Express project, sends hydropower down into the city. So that's fully dispatchable. But we need other technologies that can do this at scale as well. And the battery technology is not yet there for long duration interruptions or valleys in production that we really need to fill. So the safety systems around those technologies.
Here's an interesting question. Given all the city's resources, is it easier or harder to do retrofits in city buildings?
It's certainly a challenge, but I have to say that, the city has been leading by example for quite some time. Again, with this new administration, the decision making is happening more quickly than I've seen it happen in the past. And so I think from that level, we're starting to approach kind of the public sector where often building owners can make decisions much more quickly than city government. But city government has the ability to make investments that maybe have a longer payback period than the typical building owner is willing to do. So there's pros and cons to both. I don't think there's any magic that makes one side better or easier than the other.
Do you use, or how do you track your emissions?
So the city publishes a annual greenhouse gas inventory, right? It comes out in the fall of each year. That inventory tracks both private sector and public sector emissions. So we work with every city agency. We do benchmarking for the majority of our buildings. And we take all of that data, purchasing data, and we use that to build up the emissions that are coming from our buildings and from our non-building stationary assets, as well as our fleet, so forth.
Got it. And are you relying on third parties to collect that data, or do you have systems built in within each agency for the city to collect that data directly? Yeah,
so we're not relying on third parties. Mm-hmm. We are doing that internally. This DCAS collects all of the utility energy data, right? We do all of the account management for every city agency. So all of the electric, steam, and natural gas bills come in to DCAS. So we have that data. Then we collect heating oil use data from the agencies. We also, though, get that through our procurement office because we have citywide contracts to procure that. So we collect data from the agencies. We collect data in-house. We calibrate that data to vet it, and that's what's used to bring this all together.
Is there a particular project that has stood out for you as like an aha moment for a lesson learned on the journey for Local Law 97?
That's a great question. I think, we just completed a project. I say we in the collective city. This was the Charleston branch of New York Public Library. And that's a net zero building that was just completed. And it was done in cooperation with New York Public Library and the Economic Development Corporation, among other partners. And I think, that really showed how you combine different intervention types to really get the deep decarbonization. So there's solar on the roof there, but there's really robust demand side interventions that were done throughout that building. Not only the mechanical systems and the lighting systems, but the facade work, the building envelope work, and all of that coming together and testing it and commissioning it properly to ensure that we were getting out of the system what was designed. And that really, that commissioning and testing work was really an important aspect of this.
You talked about, I think you said $800 million spent so far. How does that work going forward? Like, are you funded already to do the project work you need to do through 2025, or do you have to rely every year on the city budget for those capital funds to do the work you need to do?
So the good news is the city has dedicated about $3.8 billion over the next 10 years for this effort, right? For both the demand side interventions and our clean energy generation or our solar PV deployment. So that pot of money is allocated to this. Each year we come up, working with our office management budget, come up with a spend plan. And that's really also done in close collaboration with our agency partners, right? Because we've got to identify the projects on an annual basis that we can do. So that builds up our spend plan for each annual cycle.
Got it. What opportunities exist for retired technical professionals to return to the workforce for local Law 97 implementation?
Hey, listen, institutional knowledge is a great thing. We really want to pull on that depth of knowledge. It's funny because the Department for Aging actually runs a program called the Reserve Program, and that is to bring professionals across all disciplines that have retired but still want to contribute, and they come back part-time. They're paid, and we can leverage the knowledge that these folks have obtained over decades worth of work experience.
Let's keep going on the labor side. Is the labor shortage more of a lack of funds for training or a lack of eligible candidates, not just for city work, but just citywide, public and private sector?
I think we said this a little bit earlier, that we've seen a waning in the trade skills, right? And I think that's a cultural thing that actually has to be addressed. I think we've got to get back to really saying, like, these are good options for our kids today. And Department of Education is doing a lot of great work on this. We've partnered with them to fund training in the CTE schools, so that the students coming right out of the high school are prepared for this type of workforce. But I think there's a cultural change there that has to happen. I think the other thing is, a curriculum that combines disciplines, right? To be really good at this work, it's really multidisciplinary. And so what am I talking about? You have to have a certain financial acumen to build pro formas and business cases to make the case to the folks that control the purse strings, right? You also have to be able to think strategically and plan. And then you need that technical knowledge, the applied knowledge of how this equipment works and how do you make it better. And I don't know that there's any curriculum out there today that brings those three things together in a comprehensive way to train our next generation of green job employees with the skills that are required for success. So love to see something around that happen.
Yeah, lot more thought can be put into that. Here's a question, I'm going to rephrase it, but it's a good one, is how fluid is the city's building portfolio, in the sense that you mentioned you have 4,000 properties, but is it always been that way? Do properties come in and out of ownership? And if you have new buildings that come into the portfolio, how does that affect your baseline from a carbon reduction standpoint?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It is fluid to a degree. Again, I go back to saying, 90% of the buildings that are here today will be here in 2050. It's the same for the overall stock of the city's buildings. But yes, we have buildings that we get out of, and some of the agencies go into leased spaces, and so that's a transfer on the accounting side of the ledger of where those greenhouse gas emissions sit. But we have new buildings all the time. I mean, just think about schools alone. We're seeing new schools being built all the time to meet the demand. And so, yes, it's fluid. And we have an absolute emission reduction that we have to obtain. So our emission inventory has to account for that growth. And we do that. We go out to our agencies every year and we survey with them for new buildings coming online, buildings that may be going offline, and even new treatment processes, especially with our wastewater resource recovery facilities and so forth, that will increase energy consumption.
Got it. Next question here is, how can the general public support what the city's doing and stay informed about the current work?
Well, I think the general public support here is critical to success. And I think, there's a number of ways. One, the inventory that we report each year. That's a great way to track the progress. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be doing that on an agency-specific way going forward. The mayor's management report that's published each year is another way. And then there are additional local laws that require us to report on things like our solar PV deployment. And so you can go to DCAS's website. There's an energy management page there. It has a link to all of these reports. But I think having public engagement and support, this is even going into your cultural institutions and your public libraries, and looking at the work that's been done in those, and letting the staff know there that you recognize it and support it and stuff. That's going to go a long way to success.
Do you have a sense for what other cities are doing to decarbonize?
They're doing much the same as we are. Some cities concentrate more on different aspects. I think Boston's been looking at first distributed technologies and energy storage, focusing in more on that. Chicago is looking to see what it can do in its buildings. This is not like magic, right? We know what we need to do in the building, so it's just being able to execute on it.
That's great. Well, we've come to the top of our hour. So, Anthony, I want to thank you for spending time at Urban Green today and answering all the great questions that came in from the audience. We really appreciate it. Congratulations on all the work you've done so far, and good luck with all those challenges ahead of you.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you to the audience out there. The questions were great. I know there's a lot of smart people out there that care a whole lot about this, and we welcome your participation. Great,
thank you. We have some great upcoming programs at Urban Green that we hope you can take a look at. We have a Cross Learning Alliance program on Habitat for Humanity on net zero green affordable homes on April 26th. Make sure you check that out. We have an Emerging Professionals Networking Happy Hour on April 28th. Those are always a great time. So if you're in the Emerging Professionals Network or want to join it, it's a great event. On May 17th, we have a case study on historic buildings for electrifying a co-op as part of our historic buildings series. So check that out. And then also we just announced for June 15th is our annual conference. This will be in person at 1 p.m. at NYU. And this year's theme is electrification to electrification, and how we can overcome barriers to a lot of the electrification issues that we talked about
I love it.
today. So today's program is a good example of the work we do at Urban Green. We take on the biggest challenges with the biggest solutions so we can have the biggest impact. We do that through our 4 key activities. We convene, we research, we advocate, and we educate. If you're not a member of Urban Green, check us out to support our work. Thanks for joining us. Anthony, thank you for joining us. Everybody stay safe. We'll see you next time.